For each tissue, you have to know where it is found, what its functions are, and what it looks like when you see it under the microscope. So let's first talk about epithelial tissue and where it is found. When you think about epithelial tissue, I want you to remember it covers, it lines, and it's in glands. It covers, it lines, and it's in glands. It covers your actual body. Your skin is composed of epithelial tissue, the outer layer anyway. It lines all of your ventral body cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity, as well as the thoracic cavity. It also lines hollow organs that open to the outside world, like your gastrointestinal tract, well, I guess I should say your alimentary tract, which basically is that tube that runs from your mouth to your anus, or as I like to say, from rooter to tutor. Another hollow organ is your urinary system. It opens to the outside world, and it is lined with epithelial tissues. And lastly, your respiratory tract. Another hollow organ that opens to the outside world. It's lined with epithelial tissue. And glands. Glands are lined with epithelial tissue. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about endocrine glands like your thyroid, or sweat glands, or salivary glands. They're all lined with epithelial tissue. In addition to covering the body, epithelial tissue also covers the organs that are found in the ventral body cavity. So your lungs, your heart, all of the viscera in your in the abdominal pelvic cavity, they're also covered with epithelial tissues. So the ventral body cavity is lined with epithelial tissue, and the organs inside are covered with epithelial tissue. Now that you know where epithelial tissue is found, let's relate that to their functions. Some epithelial tissue functions as protection, such as your skin obviously protects the deeper tissues. The epithelial tissue that covers all the organs of your ventral body cavity serve as protection. Epithelial tissue can serve as absorption or function as absorption. The epithelial tissue in your intestine, large and small, serve the function of absorbing substances from the gastrointestinal tract. Secretion is another function of epithelial tissue. That is what a gland does. It secretes. So epithelial tissue found in your glands secrete. This last one is filtration. Filtration occurs in capillaries, also occurs in your kidneys. To me, it's a little difficult at this point in the course to talk about filtration. So for now, don't worry about filtration. Focus on protection, absorption, and secretion as the functions. As I mentioned, you're going to have to be able to identify epithelial tissues under the microscope. So let's look at their distinguishing characteristics. In other words, how can you tell very easily when you look under the microscope, or if you look at an image of epithelial tissue under the microscope, how can you very easily tell you're looking at epithelial tissue? So these are images or pictures that have been drawn here on the right, and these are the same pictures that are from your book. One of the distinguishing characteristics of epithelial tissue is that the cells fit tightly together. Notice there's no room between these cells. They're fit tightly together, sort of like apartments, or houses in a new subdivision. You ever notice how they're building houses on top of one another? There's barely 10 feet between one house and the next in urban settings. So that's one thing that you look for. If you see lots of nuclei beside one another, likely you're looking at epithelial tissue. Second, do you remember I mentioned that epithelial tissue covers and it lines? Well, anything that covers or lines something has one surface that is attached to whatever it's covering or whatever it's lining, and the other surface is what? It's attached to nothing, right? Think about the shirt that you're wearing. One side of it is up against your skin, and the other side of it is up against air, right? There's nothing there. We call the surface that's attached to nothing the apical surface. The surface that is attached to deeper tissues, we call it the basal surface. But what you have to know, what's on your study guide, is the basement membrane, and that's basically this substance here that attaches the basal surface to the deeper tissues. So, under the microscope, the free surface will be up against nothing, and it will appear white under the microscope. So if you're asked to identify a tissue, and you see that it's up against white space, that's a telltale sign you're looking at epithelial tissue. Okay? And as I mentioned, the surface here is called the basement membrane, the surface that's attached to deeper tissues. This is epithelial tissue. How do you know? Notice all the little nuclei, cells up against one another like a subdivision. There's not a lot of space between them. And notice, here's the free space. Will appear as white space under the microscope. Telltale sign you're looking at epithelial tissue. Here's another example, right? This is actually taken from the small intestine. This is the lumen. That's the hollow portion of the small intestine. If this were my small intestine, the quarter pounder with cheese would be right in here, right? This is the free surface, the apical surface. This would be the basement membrane. This would be apical surface. Here you have the basement membrane. Notice there's no space between the cells. In each of these examples, the cells fit tightly together. There's very little, if any, space between the cells, and you have a free space. That's how you know you're looking at epithelial tissue. Now, once you have identified the tissue as epithelial tissue, you then have to figure out which type of epithelial tissue am I looking at. Epithelial tissue is classified based on two criteria. First is the number of layers of cells. If you are looking at a single layer of cells, such as what's shown here at the top, we classify it as simple epithelia. If there is more than one layer, it doesn't matter if it's 2, 3, 20, it is classified as stratified, right? So here at the bottom, you have stratified epithelia, more than one layer. Here's the question. This example here, is this simple or stratified? If you said stratified, you are correct. Notice you have multiple layers. What about this one? Simple or stratified? If you said simple, you are correct. Here's the apical surface. Here's the basal surface. One cell layer thick. This is on the other side of the lumen. One cell layer thick. So this is simple. We also classify epithelial tissue by the shape of its cells. And this gets very, very complicated, so I need you to focus on the next slide very, very well. Are you ready? If the cells are shaped like a column, we call them columnar. If cells are shaped like a cube, we call them cuboidal. Did I lose anybody? As you can see, that's very, very complicated. I'm kidding, of course. It's not complicated at all. If it's column shaped, they're shaped like a column, they're called columnar. If they're cube shaped, they're called cuboidal. The only one that's sort of weird would be the squamous. If they're flat cells, they're squamous. And squamous means scale, like the scale on a fish. It's flat, and so that's where it gets its name. Now, you often will not be able to actually see the plasma membranes of cells, but you will always be able to see the nuclei. And the nuclei take on the shape of the cell in general. So in a columnar cell, the nuclei will tend to be sort of elongated. If you find a nucleus that's like perfectly spheroidal, then it's probably a cuboidal cell you're looking at. And if it looks like that nucleus has been squished and it's flat, you're probably looking at a squamous or flat cell. Let's go back to those tissues we looked at earlier. Let's go down to this one at the bottom first. So, squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, right? Even though these nuclei are perfectly round, the cell shape is obviously columnar. So you're looking at simple columnar epithelium here at the bottom. What about here at the top? Well, we said this was stratified, but what about the shape? If you said stratified squamous, you are correct. Now, some of you may say, well, wait a minute, Chuck. Down here at the bottom, these cells look sort of cuboidal or maybe even columnar, but definitely not flat. And you would be correct. Here at the apical surface, they're flat, and then as we go down, they become more sort of cube-shaped. By convention, if we have multiple shapes, we name the epithelial tissue by the shape that's at the apical surface, which is obviously squamous. So this tissue at the top here is stratified squamous. And by the way, what you're looking at right here is skin. Your epidermis, the outer layer of your skin, is composed of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So you can have simple squamous, stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar. There is stratified columnar, but it's very, very rare. So you will not have to identify stratified columnar epithelial tissue. And if you look on your study guide, I made a point of putting in bold, you will not have to identify stratified columnar epithelial tissue. Likewise, you will not have to identify stratified cuboidal. I just find students have a difficult time identifying that tissue, and they don't mention it in your book, so I just went ahead and tossed these stratified cuboidal as well. And again, on your study guide in bold, it says you will not have to identify stratified cuboidal. Now, there is another type of tissue called ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. And the cells we called ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells, right? You will have to identify that. So let's take a look at that. Let's look now at how we can distinguish simple columnar from pseudostratified columnar. So let's look here on the left. So what do we see? We see this tissue here up against open space. We see that we've got one nucleus beside another. So these cells fit tightly together like sheets. So we know we're looking at epithelial tissue. Also notice we have one layer of cells, so we know we're looking at simple epithelial tissue, and it's one layer thick. This is another tissue type under here. So this is one layer thick. So we're looking at simple columnar epithelial tissue. Let's look here on the right. Again, we have open space. And we have cells fitting tightly together like sheets, and they're column shaped. Notice, however, that the nuclei bounce around up and down. It appears to be stratified, but in actuality, it's not. This is pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Do you know what pseudo means? It means false. So in other words, it's pseudo-stratified, or in other words, it looks like it's stratified, but really it's just one layer of cells. So what's up with the bouncing around of the nuclei? Well, what you have here are columnar cells that are packaged tightly together, so tight in fact that in some of the cells the nuclei is pushed toward the apical surface, and in others it's pushed down toward the basement membrane. So it gives the illusion that you've got more than one cell layer, but in actuality it's just one cell layer. So it looks like it's stratified, but in actuality it's simple. So that's where it gets the name pseudo-stratified. Now you may be like, oh my gosh, Chuck, really? Both of the cells look like they're bouncing around to me. Maybe if you put the two cells, the two slides beside one another, I can figure out which one is simple columnar and which one is pseudostratified. But if either one were by itself, I don't know if I could distinguish simple columnar from pseudostratified. Well, never fear when Chuck is near. There's something else that will indicate if it's pseudostratified. In lab, pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue will always be taken from the trachea. It lines the trachea, that is your windpipe. In the trachea, a layer of mucus covers the outer surface of the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. That mucus is supposed to catch all the little nasties that are in the air that you breathe, like mold spores and bacteria and dust, etc., so that it doesn't get to your lungs. After the mucus traps all that foreign particles and cells, there's a layer of cilia that's supposed to move that mucus away from your lungs and back toward your pharynx or throat. So, if you've determined that you're looking at columnar epithelial tissue, the next step is to see if there are cilia. If there's cilia, then you know you're looking at pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue as opposed to simple columnar. Notice there's no cilia associated with columnar epithelial tissue, which, by the way, is found in your stomach and your small and large intestine. Before wrapping up epithelial tissue, I'd like to mention glands for a moment, because as you know, glands are composed of epithelial tissue. However, they are specifically composed of cuboidal epithelial tissue. This is a figure from another A&P book, not yours, and if you look, notice these cells lining this gland. This is probably a sweat gland, although I don't know that for sure. In an actual microscope image, it would look like this. Notice you've got a single layer of tube-shaped epithelial cells. All glands, whether we're talking about sweat glands or salivary glands or endocrine glands, are composed of cuboidal epithelial tissue. To summarize, epithelial tissues cover and they line, so they always will have a free surface. Under the microscope, that free surface will appear as white space. Epithelial tissues, their cells form sheets, so you'll see nuclei packed tightly together. Once you've identified the tissue as epithelial tissue, you then have to identify the specific type. Epithelial tissues are classified, one, by the number of cell layers. If it's one cell layer, it's simple. If there are multiple cell layers, it's stratified. Second, they're classified by the shape of the cells. If the cells are flat, they are squamous. If they are cube-shaped, they're cuboidal. And if they are column-shaped, they are columnar.